Good afternoon. My name is Dina Kiwan from the University of Birmingham in the UK, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's webinar, What Would an Inclusive Beirut Look Like? We'll be starting off watching a video, but first, just a couple of basic announcements. One, you will see that there is sign language interpretation, and there's also English and Arabic interpretation available. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom, there's like a globe where you can click interpretation. And also, if you have questions throughout, there's a Q&A box where you can type your question, and we will aim to answer a selection of the questions during the final session after the presentations. I will just give you a brief background to our speakers this evening. So firstly, we have Dr. Itab Shuayb. She has a PhD in inclusive design, and she teaches inclusive design at the American University of Beirut. She's also a steering member committee for the Disability Hub, and she has written a recent book called Inclusive University Built Environments, the Impact of Approved Document M for Architects, Designers, and Engineers. Secondly, I'd like to welcome you to Grace Khawam, who is a public health professional, but also a disability activist. And she's currently doing her PhD on disability and development at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. She also is a university instructor at Saint Joseph University in Beirut, and she teaches 2 graduate courses as part of the Masters in the Public Health program. Unfortunately, Ibrahim Abdallah is not able to be with us for this evening's session, but Dr. Itab Shuayb will present on his behalf. His areas of expertise are in disability and employment, and has worked with UN agencies such as ILO and ESQA. And then the final speaker will be Fadi Al Halabi, who is a psychotherapist and counselor, but he's also been very involved in the field of inclusion of persons with disabilities. In 2006, he founded the Ecumenical Disability Advocates Network to champion the rights of people with disabilities in Lebanon and throughout the Middle East. And then finally, he also acts as a TV and radio talk show host, and often speaks in universities and in the civic sphere as well. So now we'll move to the life cycle video, and then we'll follow with the talks. Welcome, everybody.
I am Noor. My mom uses a wheelchair. During her pregnancy, Mom found difficulties getting her needs met at the hospital. While the building had a ramp and a lift so Mom could physically get inside the hospital, it was very challenging to get her height and weight because the weighing scale and the other medical equipment were not made for users who can't stand up on their own. Yet I insisted to come to this world, even with all the difficulties that Mom had at the hospital. Because my father is not Lebanese, I could not get a Lebanese citizenship because the Lebanese citizenship law is gender biased. I was denied the Lebanese passport, a social security number, and a healthcare card. In a playground nearby, my friends could play happily with their parents and peers, but my mom and I could not join because the stairs were the only way down and Mom could not use stairs. During my school years, being a left-handed person, it was hard for me to write because my study desk was only designed for right-hand users. Having dyslexia as a learning difficulty, my teacher did not know much about my educational needs and could not provide the proper educational methods to assist me. I am proud to say that despite all the difficulties I experienced, with perseverance and help from those who cared, I managed to graduate from high school. Here's my graduation photo with my mom and dad. Now came time for university. I wanted to choose a program that I'm passionate about and offered somewhere close to home. Sadly, I could not afford the high tuition fees, so I had to settle for a cheaper program that is also closer to home. With the absence of public transportation serving between my home and work, I spent precious time and effort in commuting. Life is short, and time passes by quickly. With old age comes wisdom, but our physical abilities and our movements change. Despite its lovely architecture combining heritage and modern style, Beirut is not yet designed to be accessible to us in all life stages. I wish I could stay and age in my home, move independently, and enjoy activities with my children and grandchildren. But because my home is not designed to be old age friendly, I have difficulty with the most basic things, like reaching items in the kitchen or using the bedroom on my own. So my doctor advised that I move in with my child to have the assistance I need. If our laws and architecture were tailored to our needs in each stage of life without any discrimination, I could be granted a Lebanese passport, a national security number, and a healthcare card. My mom could have accessed the hospital and used the medical equipment independently. I could have accompanied mom in her wheelchair, and we would have enjoyed playing together like all the other families. I could have adjusted and used the study desk to my preference. My teacher could have used different multisensory educational methods, such as the embossed letters, to improve my word recognition and spelling. I could have chosen the program that I'm passionate about, among many different programs offered at the National University. And I could have used the inclusive public transportation that serves all and commuted easily between work and home. And if my home is designed to serve my needs in every stage of life, I could have managed to live independently and do the daily activities in my bedroom and kitchen and enjoy the activities with my children and grandchildren from the comfort of my own home. Inclusive design and law make Beirut a city for all. Life Cycle and the Story of Inclusive Design video, designed and produced by the Disability Hub Center for Lebanese Studies, LEU, funded by the Disability Under Siege Project, the Global Challenges Research Fund, GCRF, Arts and Humanity Research Council, AHRC, in partnership with Birmingham University, planned and supervised by Dr. Itab Shuayb, Inclusive Design Specialist, directed by the Institute for Media Research and Training, with team crew, Samer Bayhom, Karim Fayyad, Leah Ghalayini, Sabina Boutros, and Salim Laham. Music title, Brooks, composed by Kai Engel, licensed under Creative Commons. Animator Tala Salman, narrator Layal Salman, acting team Aya Turbe, Noor Shaheen, Sonia Der Alexanyan, Karim Fayyad, Sabina Boutros, and Maysa Ashar. Children, Perla Baitam, Ahmed Baitam, Nadia Abu Rjaili, and Layal Al-Hroob. Special thanks to the Overseas Interpreting, Virtual Box, and the Disability Hub Steering Committee, Copyright CLS 2020.
Well, thank you for that. We'll now move to Dr. Itab Shuayb, who will tell us a little bit about the story producing the Life Cycle video campaign and its relation to turning Beirut into an inclusive city, particularly since the Beirut blast in August.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Dina, for moderating this session and introducing us. Today, we will be talking about our vision as a disability hub in reshaping Beirut so it can be an inclusive city that responds to diverse needs of people. At the moment, the picture that we are seeing is about Mar Mikhail Street, which was severely affected by the blast. The credit goes to Ms. Tala Salman, who was part of our team in mapping Beirut, and she's now working on, we're working together on producing 2 guidelines about creating heritage schools, heritage buildings and schools to be inclusive. So I will be now talking about how our vision will be and about the video campaign. Okay, just a minute. So how, to answer this question, we want to know, in order to create an inclusive city or an inclusive service, we want to know whether our built environment and services include our diverse needs. So we want to know who are the groups that they are excluded. We noticed that people with different age group, especially we're talking about children and elderly, are completely excluded from services. People with different gender as well, they don't, not all buildings acknowledge their needs. People who have left and right-handed, people with different body shapes and heights, people with diverse ethnic backgrounds, families with children, people with different disability groups, and people who have different diets or who follow a strict diet or are vegetarian, they might as well not have the service that they need. So acknowledging that many services in Lebanon are still inaccessible for many people, we decided to produce in 2017 our first campaign as the Center for Lebanese Studies. And it was the first campaign to introduce the concept of inclusive design. It was titled Shaghli Sahli, or It's Simple. It was composed of 5 videos. One of them was a documentary that introduces and defines inclusive design. And then the 4 videos shed lights on different barriers that people encounter in Lebanon. The campaign was really successful, and we worked hard on making sure that the videos are accessible as well. So we provided sign language, we provided subtitles in 2 languages. However, feedback from some users, especially people with visual impairments, mentioned that they found some difficulties in accessing the background content. So we decided to fill that gap in any product that we will produce or any campaign that we will produce. And that's why when we did the life cycle video, we filled that gap. So the story of inclusive design and the life cycle started when we were thinking of, producing that video between 2019 and 20, when we noticed that there are many incidents which shed lights on the importance of inclusion. The 17 October Lebanese uprising was the main one, when people went to the street and demanded their rights to have equal access to education, employment, social protection. Also, we noticed that with the pandemic, people with disabilities and many vulnerable groups in Lebanon and across the world, they were the most affected by the pandemic. So we noticed that there are still many physical and attitudinal barriers that restrict people from gaining access to services. And that's why we decided, to produce this video and cover the main things to promote inclusive design in Lebanon. So my understanding of inclusive design is that it takes into account the diverse human, cultural, and life cycles to improve human interaction, social participation, health, and wellness. And we can only achieve this by involving people in the all aspects of design, from the beginning till the development till the implementation of the design. And all of these stages we followed while we were producing the life cycle video. When we started the first writing the first script of the life cycle, it was a few days before the Beirut blast. So we wanted to focus on the stage of birth, childhood, youth, and the elderly. And we wanted to make sure that the main demands which people were talking about, to have the right for healthcare, free education, employment, and social protection and security, they will be highlighted in the video. We wanted to focus on the main barriers such as accessing hospital, school, workplace, transportation, and housing. And at the end, we wanted to end up the video by showing that inclusive design and following the inclusive approach can lead to creating an inclusive service that responds to people's diverse needs. So these are the ones before the blast. We didn't have education. We didn't, there wasn't a place in mind because we wanted the video to, it can be applied in any country. However, after the blast, we decided to target and to set the location about Beirut itself because it was damaged and we know that it will be reconstructed. So we thought that it would be the perfect timing to promote inclusion as the city will be rebuilt again, so it can be rebuilt this time in an inclusive way. And we ended up the script with inclusive design and law make Beirut a city for all, because if we want to achieve inclusion, it's not only by making our services inclusive, but also by changing policies and strategies and changing laws, because we know that still in Lebanon our laws are excluding many people, such as the Lebanese woman who, if married to a non-Lebanese, she cannot pass her nationality to their citizen, to her children. So the right of citizenship was one of the main things that we focused on in our video. The most interesting part was the whole process of producing the video, where we applied inclusive design, not only in the video and its content, but also in the whole stage of producing the video. So we applied the participatory approach. We had constructive feedback from different people who have different abilities. We worked closely with the sign language interpreters, particularly the Lebanese Federation of the Deaf and the overseas interpreters, where they were so much involved in the content, in making sure that the script is simple and easy to understand. We as well, the story itself was inclusive in a way that even the characters and the people, we had diverse people, such as the father was non-Lebanese, to highlight the issue of the nationality and the condition of Lebanese not being able to pass her nationality to the children. We included animations that matches the live scenes to make the video as well accessible for everyone. Even children, when watching it, they can understand the message. We provided descriptive narrative language without missing any important detail from the beginning till the end, to make sure that the content is accessible for people with visual impairments. We included as well 100% closed captioning, accuracy in Arabic and English, so that people with who do not use the sign language, they can as well use the captioning to have access to the content. So this, it was really an interesting part in making this video, because we applied the inclusion throughout the whole production. As our aim as the Disability Hub is to promote inclusion, we are still working and focusing on promoting inclusion. And this involves our recent work in working on mapping the inclusivity of needs and reconstruction initiatives during Beirut blast. So we are at the moment will be launching soon in March, in beginning of March, hopefully, a report about our research findings of the mapping in Beirut and whether it was inclusive or not. We will be including recommendations and for the future. So if we want to have a reconstruction of Beirut, it will be inclusive. And also if any kind of an emergency, so we will be providing an emergency strategy to be inclusive. Also, we are producing inclusive guidelines for heritage and school buildings, so those can be used in the reconstruction phase of Beirut. Finally, I would like to end my presentation by saying that to achieve an inclusive cities in Beirut or any other city, there should be a collaboration between partners from different disciplines, and also a collaboration with people, involving people with disabilities, people with end users, in the design of Beirut or any country, to make sure that any service we're providing responds to the diverse people with diverse needs. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Itab. We'll now move to Grace Khawam's presentation. She will be discussing the challenges and opportunities for inclusive education in Lebanon with a rights-based focus. She will then suggest approaches and strategies to ensure equitable quality education for all. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you, Dr. Kiwan. And I am honored to be part of this extraordinary panel and to be part of the Disability Hub as well. And so I will start by presenting a snapshot of the current situation of inclusive education in Lebanon, with a specific focus on the challenges, but also on the opportunities. And I will be suggesting 10 key strategic approaches, which I feel should be rolled out immediately, given the current circumstances of the country and of the pandemic. And just before we start, I do have a bit of a disclaimer to start with. And so even if I am presenting this as an academic and as an activist, and what I will be presenting stems from my research and also from my readings of the current situation, it also reflects my reflections and my personal journey as a mother of a child, of a beautiful little girl with an intellectual disability. And therefore many of the examples also stem from my own experiences of navigating through the education system in Lebanon and striving to find what is best for my daughter. And so let me just move across the slides. The focus of my talk will be on inclusive education, but why is education important altogether? If we start with some statistics, only 1% of children with disabilities in Lebanon are enrolled in public education. And about 80% of persons with disabilities in Lebanon are or have never been employed. And if we're just going to talk about a consequence of that, exclusion of people with disabilities from the workplace leads to an estimated $1.37 to $1.94 trillion in annual loss in GDP annually. And this is I'm just talking about a financial cost. Obviously, work and inclusive employment for people with disability should not just be looked at from an economic perspective. But we cannot be talking about inclusive employment or equitable job opportunities for everyone when youth or adults with disabilities have never been exposed to any significant learning opportunity. before. And if they go through a whole education system which does not provide adequate opportunities for learning and personal growth, or which does not provide equal education outcomes, qualifications, or certifications, that is, if they even accessed any type of education in the first place, how can society expect persons with disabilities to be able to competitively position themselves in the job market and be recognized as valued contributors to modern day life? Next slide. I'm sorry about the electricity cut. We are in Lebanon after all. And so why inclusive education? I would not like to dwell too much on the inclusive mainstream education versus special education debate. There's a lot of literature on that. And while there is ample evidence that children with disabilities have better learning outcomes when they are in appropriate, suitable, accessible, supportive, mainstream inclusive settings, some debates still exist. So I'm just going to adopt the definition presented by the International Disability Alliance. I hope that you can see me again. Yes, okay. And so according to IDA, inclusive education is a system, and I will focus on the word system. It is a system that caters for, is accessible to, and supports every child. And I'm just going to drop, I would like us to read together this sentence, the statement that is also drawn from the recent report by IDA. The challenge of reconciling the ideals of special education as a service and inclusive education, the system, have resulted in an appropriation of the concepts and language of inclusive education by supporters of special education, who use the often failed attempts at placing children and youth with disabilities in mainstream classes as the examples of the failure of inclusive education. And so if the system is not working, if the current system is not working, if children are not doing well when they are placed in mainstream settings, this does not mean that inclusive education as a system should not be what we strive for. It means that we have a broken current system, and this is what we need to be working on. And so what do our policies say? The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability obviously promotes inclusive education at all levels and lifelong learning. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Lebanon ratified in 1991, there is a goal for full inclusion. The only law that we have, which is related to disability and education in Lebanon, is Law 220, and it does not specifically promote inclusive education. It does state that the child has a right to go to regular schools and to special education when needed. So what in all of these policies, what they all agree on is that there are three main principles when it comes to education for children with disabilities. I would just like to highlight the global and even the national trend or consensus of supporting inclusive education in discourses and even in high-level meetings. And I think it has become a buzzword, and everyone is just talking about inclusive education. Sorry. And yes, we are all with inclusive education. We are all promoting this, but I don't think we are all actually seeing the actual itty-bitty detail of what this would entail. And there's also a general lack of sufficient research about this topic in Lebanon. So there's just a tiny bit of a reality check that I would like to present with this presentation. First of all, sorry. The main misconception. People think that access to education for children and youth with disabilities is kind of like a gateway, right? Is it just about the school welcoming them or not, having, saying, yes, you can be a student in my school or not. And they expect that once the school accepts or admits the student as a student in the school, everything has been settled. Where the reality is really not this. And entry into a suitable school is just the first step. And I would say, and also from personal struggle, it is the ultimate obstacle course, right? And I can really clearly say that we do not yet have an inclusive education system in Lebanon. Even if we do have initiatives, even we do have attempts, we have various schools that have tried out different models, and we will be talking about the different models, but we do not yet have an inclusive education system. And there are very few people who actually reach the finish line. And even if it has been successful for some people, this is just anecdotal success. This is not, we are very far from saying, yes, every child in Lebanon has a right for equitable and is actually accessing equitable, inclusive education. And so in the absence of a universal learning system in Lebanon, and also lack of policies being effectively implemented, the educational options highly depend on socioeconomic status, nationality, legal status, interpersonal, structural, environmental factors, and I can go on and on. This just shows how much the context is unstable and how much all of the burden of navigating through this obstacle course, more often than not, just falls on the parents. And so let us look at the options, okay? There's in the movie we just saw, there's Noor, and I am a big fan of storytelling. And so Noor has a learning disability. She can symbolically represent any other child in Lebanon with any other type of impairment who is trying to access or trying to get into education. So let us just look a bit about the options, okay? I'm just going to briefly talk about early childhood education. And this is just something that says, you do know in the system in Lebanon, there is the disability card and there are eligibility criteria for that disability card. But the disability card only provides access to services, essentially starting education services or institution services, essentially starting age 3. So everything up until age 3 is completely at the expense of the parents. Whereas we do know that for most of the disabilities, I would say for childhood in general, early intervention is very important. And so there is a major gap at that level. Okay, so what options do we have? Options would either include going through the public or the private sector or the NGO sector, depending on where you live, your nationality, your socioeconomic considerations, and other considerations. And very often, unfortunately, and you can see the big circle, the big blue circle that I have, none of these options are viable, affordable, or accessible options. And we do know that a significant proportion of children with disabilities in Lebanon remain outside of any type of education. And so in the public sector, schools are still not inclusive in the full sense of the term. We know that there is currently a pilot project that was launched with MEHE and with UNICEF in 30 public schools. A lot of learning is still coming out of this pilot, but we still have a long way to go. And unfortunately, discriminatory practices are still existent and have been documented, where schools refuse entry to children with disability just based due to their disability. This is also happening, unfortunately, in private schools and institutions. If a person does indeed go through the private education system, this direct substantive costs. It's costs, because even in both special education and in mainstream schools, is my connection okay? Okay. I'll just remove the video. Okay, and so even in both special education and mainstream schools, a student with disability would have to pay much more than his or her peers for just attending and being a student at the same school. The third option would be to go into the NGO sector, okay, where many NGOs are subsidized by MOSA, by the state, and where there have been also significant delays in, the state paying its dues. And this would entail a segregated, specialized setting, sometimes even in residential settings, where education can be provided or in formal or informal formats. There's also no official structure to monitor the quality of the education services provided, and these services generally do not provide the same certification or qualification than mainstream education. So I have set here a list of barriers. Okay, barriers to accessibility. And let us just talk about the concept of non-discrimination. So I'm going back to these three main principles that everybody agrees on, right? And so discrimination on the basis of disability is unfortunately still happening. We are also seeing something called the disabilist normalization, which is actually a discriminatory selection criteria based on how the student looks. So if they look normal, between quotation, or if they behave normally, even if they do have a disability, they are accepted in some school or not. And if they look differently, they are rejected. We can also see some hierarchy in disability. Some, I would say, against the other, unfortunately. Obviously, if you do have a refugee status, there's obviously even more added levels of discrimination. And we all know that there have been reports of bullying and abuse happening against children with disability. So let's jump to inclusion, which is the third principle. And I think everyone is familiar with this graphic, which kind of explains the difference between exclusion, segregation, integration, and inclusion. I'm just going to talk slightly about the different modalities that are currently existing within the current education system in Lebanon. So we do have segregation, which is, special schools, special education schools, institutions, which is still quite running, and it is still receiving governmental funding, and also sometimes, most of the time, external funding as well. Integration is what we see in many schools currently. They do adopt a pull-out system, so the child is in class, he or she is pulled out for therapy, for follow-up, etc. Or a lot of the time, we have a separate classroom within the school, and it's kind of called, we can consider it a school within a school. A lot of schools also adopt the principle of a shadow teacher. So they say, yes, the child is welcome in the classroom, but the parents need to afford and pay for a shadow teacher to assist this child. While we all know that the shadow teacher can be very helpful, a lot of the time, it should not in any way replace the teacher. And so the teacher of the classroom still has the requirement to be able to adequately teach this child. And most of the time, what we see happening is that this shadow teacher is replacing the teacher. It is creating dependency, and it goes against any kind of autonomy that is being requested, any kind of autonomy that we try to build in the child. And so there is a need for meaningful participation. And I would like to also include that inclusion in itself, as it is presented in this graphic, is not enough in any way. So it's not just having the child there. So let's say if a child is on a wheelchair and he's excluded from lab, lab experiments, just because the laboratory is not accessible, that is not called inclusion. Okay, so there are various modalities, and unfortunately, we still have a long way to go. So post-secondary education, just a quick snapshot on that. Often these are the same challenges. Let me just check how much time. Okay, I'll try to move quickly. I think I'm quite on with time. Okay, so post-secondary education and transition to employment, there is a major gap, and this is a major concern for all parents. Okay, once the child actually graduates from school or completes any kind of level of education, what happens next? And there is a major gap in the transition to employment, and this is also a focus in my current PhD research. We need to address job readiness skills, internship opportunities, and even various types of models which actually facilitate employment for people with disabilities. I can talk very quickly about the multiple crises. Unfortunately, we all know the current situation in Lebanon. Multiple crisis means multiplying disparities. And with the financial crisis, there are many schools that have been struggling to survive. With the Beirut explosion, we all know that there have been schools that have been directly damaged, private and public. And the pandemic in itself is causing so many different additional layers of difficulties, of accessibility, of discrimination, and of inclusion for children with disabilities, with the inadequacy of, or sometimes also the lack of online learning formats. This is causing further isolation from teachers and peers, and there's actually a risk of regression in learning outcomes among these pupils, these students. And so I'm just going to, okay, this is a very grim picture, I know. Let's just focus on what needs to be done, okay? And I'm going to say this is not the dream. This is not a utopia. There are various opportunities for inclusive education in Lebanon. And I'm not going to go through, I think my video is back. I hope that it is. Yes, okay. And so there are various opportunities. Obviously working on the policy, on the curriculum, on teaching methods, on the school infrastructure, and ensuring that reasonable accommodations, including assistive technology, are put in place. I'm not going to go too much through this. There are various guidelines that are developed, that are there. We all know what needs to happen. And it has been, and there are some references that I put at the end regarding this. But if I would say the key messages that I would like to focus on throughout this presentation. And this is what I'm calling it action now, okay? These are things that can happen right now. None of what we are presenting and what we are talking about is a utopia. This is not a dream, okay? It is not a dream to have inclusive education. This is, first of all, a right. Okay, we need to stop using inclusive education as a card to get money, or presenting this as this dream that we all inspire of. This is a right. Every child in Lebanon has a right for equitable, just, appropriate, and quality education. Okay, and here I come to my second key message, and this is specifically addressed to my colleagues, I would say, and fellow professionals working in the disability field. I urge you, let us shift the language, okay? Let us stop using paternalizing, romanticizing, charity discourse. Let us not get carried away with the media sensationalizing of disability. And let us not perpetuate this differential representation of persons with disabilities. Let us not call people with disabilities angels on earth. I know my daughter is not an angel. She's quite mischievous, I have to agree. And let us stop calling people with disability as people with a strong will. If you have a disability, that does not make you extraordinary. It makes you a citizen who has rights, and these rights should be met. I did write about this in an article that was published last year. Every single person has the right to an optimal learning environment. I'm just putting this here so that we kind of move away from the sterile debate about inclusive education versus special education. I think that this is a sterile debate. I think that wherever the child chooses or currently is, needs to be an optimal learning environment for this child, whether they are in a segregated environment or whether they are in an inclusive environment, whether they are learning online currently, or wherever they are, they have the right to an optimal learning environment. Number 4, the universal design and learning, and this is something, there's a universal shift. So we're not just talking about education in mainstream settings, we're moving into mainstream universal education. And I'm just going to show a quick, I know many people have seen this graphic before. It just kind of shows the difference between equality, equity, and universal design. I still have 6 more points. Okay, so number 5, forcing inclusion can be detrimental. And this is also a plea, a plea for action, and also a plea for people to be careful. Do no harm, okay? Everyone is pushing for inclusion. Obviously, this is something that we all want. But inclusion, if it's not done in a right way, okay, this can actually be very detrimental for a child. And I have a small of a disclaimer here. And people who know me personally know that my girl currently goes to a special education school. This does not mean that I do not believe or I do not promote or advocate for inclusive education, but I do not want her to be a guinea pig. in some school where they will try to fight a system and the system is not helping. Okay, so let us really think about this. And number 6 is something very important, and I feel that there's a lot of resistance here. I don't know among the participants what your opinions would be about this, but there needs to be a transfer. Okay, there needs to be sharing of expertise from these incredible special education institutions that we have in Lebanon that have, acquired so many experience across the years in working with people with disability. And shifting that to mainstream schools. Number 7, I will move a bit more quickly, inclusive policy as an imperative, that is for sure. Number 8 would be self-advocacy. For children and youth with disability, they need to recognize the disableism that is out there and to know their rights and to have the appropriate skills to advocate for their own rights. Number 9 and number 10, this goes to the international community, okay? We need to be strategically using donor money that is coming out and that is pouring into Lebanon after the explosion, after the economic crisis, after the pandemic, okay? And now it is now more than ever the time to put these resources into inclusive reconstruction and into education reform. And number 10 is a final key message for my colleagues that are currently working in NGOs and especially international NGOs and maybe also the UN agencies. We need you to be our allies. We do not need you to be implementers, okay? We do not need you to be, hiring specialists and therapists and trying to implement inclusion projects in schools. We want you to become inclusive. We want you to practice what you preach. We want your offices to be inclusive and to offer job opportunities for people with disabilities. We want you to be to mainstream disability inclusion in all of your activities, in all of your projects, in all of your surveys. We want disability disaggregated data. We want you to be helping us with providing rigorous data because you have rigorous M&E systems. And this is where you will really become our allies. And yes, so every child has a right for inclusive, equitable, quality education to help them reach their full potential. This is it for me. I'm sorry if I went a bit over time.
Thank you very much, Grace. Very interesting and passionate presentation. I'm now going to pass to Itab, who will present Ibrahim Abdallah's presentation. His expertise is around employment. So we're moving now from the education sphere and the slide where Grace mentioned the impacts coming from education onto employment. Welcome.
Hi everybody, hi again. I will be presenting Dr. Ibrahim Abdallah's, will be reciting his presentation. So as we mentioned before, that the Beirut port explosion on 4th of August has affected and has created a humanitarian crisis with significant immediate and long-term ramifications. Numerous urgent needs have surfaced among residents affected by the explosion, namely access to alternative housing, education, healthcare, as well as compensation for heightened income insecurity caused by the lost economic activity and erosion of work and employment opportunities. This comes in addition to the impact of the continuous economic crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, and the uprising of 17 October that have compounded the socio-economic vulnerabilities of residents nationwide and exposed the weaknesses and inequalities of the social protection system. The compounded mentioned crises have caused a lot of negative impacts on the businesses and workplaces and increased the already high level of unemployment among people with disabilities. So we can see that people with disabilities in every kind of crisis, they are the most affected by this crisis with the lack of inclusive policies from the government. So, just a minute. So the Lebanese legislation before Law 220 related to the rights of people with disabilities recognized the right to work for every citizen without mentioning people with disabilities, and didn't include any measures to ensure that their rights, they have the right to gain access to work or to have any schemes for work. These legislations did not also embrace the principles of inclusion, non-discrimination, gender equality, and recent work for all in labor markets for people with disabilities. The Lebanese legislation dealt with work and employment through two main comprehensive laws. The labor law of 1946, which governs the private sector, and the employees regulation 112 of 1959, which governs the public sector. Both laws are comprehensive and do not discriminate in any of their articles of the basis of disability, religion, or gender, but do not include any mechanisms to combat discrimination and do not adopt any inclusive employment policies. So as we can see that we have laws, but there's nothing to implement the laws. So they also do not take into account the needs of people with disabilities, especially with regard to reasonable accommodation, accessibility, and incubator environment. Law 220 in its Article 68 stipulates that people with disabilities have the right to work on an equal basis with others, and that the state is obliged to assist those people to enter a labor market based on the principle of equal opportunities. This is in line with the objectives of the CRPD in its Article 27 and the SDG Goal 8. Article 69 of the Law 220 in its paragraph A stipulates that disability does not constitute a barrier to nomination of any job. And paragraph C of the same article came to emphasize this text by considering that the competency-related exams and the applicable apprenticeship period are sufficient to accept or reject employment. It's important to note that no implementation decrees or administrative instructions have been issued to activate the rights mentioned in this part. So again, we can see that we have the law, and it prohibits discrimination, and it promotes access for people with disabilities to mainstream work, etc., and workplace, but it doesn't have any kind of enforcing for the implementation. Article 73 and 74 of Law 220 define a specific quota, 3% of jobs for people with disabilities in the public and private sector, but it did not establish any mechanisms to implement this quota. The quota did not contradict with what the CRP seeks, as long as it's considered a transitional stage towards full economic inclusion, and the quota legislation are compatible with the principles of the convention. However, there are many other factors that they create an obstacle for including people with disabilities in work. The first one is reasonable accommodation. According to the CRPD, reasonable accommodations means necessary and appropriate modification and adjustments, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden, and needed in a particular case to ensure that people with disabilities they can have access and they can enjoy or exercise on the basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So that means that accessibility, according to the CRPD, it means that to take appropriate measures to ensure that people with disabilities have access on a equal basis with others to the physical environment, transportation, information, and communication, including technologies and systems to other facilities and services, that they should be open and provided to the public, both in urban and in rural areas. Law 220 limited accessibility to the physical part, so it didn't include anything related to accessibility to the information or to the workplace. It spoke of removing all physical barriers in order to allow people with disabilities to access all public and private buildings intended for public services. Again, if we notice from our reports now that we were working on, we noticed that most of the buildings, even the public buildings, are still inaccessible. So there is no implication, there was no way of implementing the law with the absence of regulations. Internet and assistive technology, these two factors, they have made a quantum leap in the lives of people with disabilities, and they changed many standards for engaging in public life, especially in the field of employment. According to the American Assistive Technology Act 2004, assistive technology device is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially, off the shelf, modified, or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of people with disabilities. The CRPD has recognized access to assistive technology as a human right. Assistive technology has opened many career fields for people with disabilities. However, it remains expensive and has not yet been covered by the Ministry of Social Affairs, Disability Rights, and Access Program. As for the internet, people with disabilities have benefited from it and used it within the employment and training framework. Transportation, this is the factor that is the main factor that affects people with disabilities, and its availability, giving them independence that allows them to obtain and maintain jobs on an equal basis with others. The Traffic and Transportation Law 243 of 2012 does not adopt any inclusive transport policy or contain any provision regarding accessibility and disability needs. Article 44 of the Law 220 stipulates that the Ministry of Transport shall provide buses and other transportation means that are accessible and designed for the use of people with disabilities according to the international standard of safety. However, Law 220, again, it doesn't adopt any policy on inclusive transportation. And this is what we have highlighted when we produced the video, the life cycle video, that with the absence of public transportation and inclusive transportation, many people are affected, not only people with disabilities, but people, families with children, and people with visual impairments, etc. So they are elderly as well. They can be as well finding difficulty in accessing services with the lack of inclusive transportation. So what has to be done? Lebanese legislations must adopt inclusive policies and contain effective mechanisms intended to include people with disabilities in an inclusive labor market. The Law 220 must be amended to contain a provision on reasonable accommodation in the area of employment. They must adopt the concept of accessibility in its wider sense and in accordance with Article 9 of the CRPD. Labor and employee laws should be amended to embrace the principles of equal opportunities and gender equality in the area of employment and must contain a mechanism to prevent discrimination. The needs of people with disabilities must be taken into consideration, including the incubator environment and the accessible workplace. So even if we will have inclusive transportation and the workplace itself is inaccessible, then we are still finding barriers that will restrict us from gaining access to services. The construction code 646 must be amended to ensure accessibility for people with disabilities in public areas and public and private buildings intended for public use. Finally, it's about the Traffic and Transportation Law 243. It must be amended to guarantee for people with disabilities an accessible and inclusive public and private transportation system, expanding the assistive aids provided by MOSA disability rights and access program to include assistive technology devices, either free of charge or at reasonable prices, can as well lead to promote a workplace where the services are accessible, the technology and the assistive devices are there to enable people with disabilities to work and to contribute to their society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Itab, for presenting Ibrahim Abdallah's very interesting presentation. I'll now move to Fadi Al Halabi. So he's going to be focusing on the effects of the one-year-old global pandemic that comes with both challenges and opportunities. And he's particularly going to be focusing on the issues of mental health for people with disabilities, and also particularly in the context of the Beirut blast. So questions that he's posing are we all in the same boat? What are the lessons learned from this so-called new normal? And what post-traumatic growth can we actively hope for? Welcome, Fadi.
Thank you, Dr. Kiwan, for your lovely presentation. It's always a pleasure to be part of the Disability Hub to share our challenges, hope, and dreams for our beloved Lebanon, especially beloved Beirut. I hope that the participants still have the energy to listen and to follow up, because it's been one hour we are talking, so I will try to be brief as much as possible and to open the space for the question and feedback. I'm trying to share the presentation, but my screen is freezing. Are you still able to hear me, Dr. Kiwan?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
we can hear you.
Okay, the screen is a little bit freezed, so I will wait a little bit just that I can introduce as much as I can. So
shall I share the screen, Fadi?
Let's wait for 1 minute. I can introduce before the sharing the screen. So I think when we talk about inclusive society, education, employment, social life, it's all part of our final aim, is to have a life, a fulfilling life, where we can lead really a life with passion and meaning. So that's why the aim is really to have this high level of mental health and well-being. Because today our understanding of mental health and well-being is not related to the absence of illness or distress or dysfunction. It's more about how can we maximize
I think we've lost you, Fadi, there.
Maybe we can stop the video. Okay, Dina, shall we check like the Q&A a bit until Fadi joins again, because there's a connection problem?
Yes, sure. So actually Grace and I were just communicating about a few questions that have come up in relation to her talk. So a lot of engagement with your talk, Grace. There's a question from Marwan and Neil. I think it was to do with some of the initial statistics you presented at the beginning, and the question is it based on the entire number of persons with disabilities? That's the first question.
Right, so I would just quickly answer that. So that was a number. Oh, my connection is unstable as well. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so that statistic was taken from the Combas report on the situation of persons with disability in Lebanon. I kind of on purpose did not want to put too much statistics into my presentation because there is wide discrepancies in the statistics that we do have in Lebanon. And a lot of the time, this goes for, first of all, we do not actually know how many, we have an estimate, but we don't actually know the exact number of children and youth with disability in Lebanon. That goes because not all of them are registered within the MOSA registries, and the eligibility, how would you define disability? So yes, I think that question, I'm just answering directly to Marwan, that goes into the Combas report, but we do not have representative statistics, unfortunately, for children in Lebanon. I think there's another question from Dr. Musa Sharafuddin.
Yes, so this is about the MRHE 20 inclusive schools. Are you aware of?
Yes, I think that's maybe that's a typo. I think he means the MEHE, the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, the pilot project with UNICEF for 30 to create 30 inclusive schools. All I know is that this is a pilot project. It did start in 2018. There has been some training of teachers. I know that there has been disability specialists or experts being contracted for this project. I do know that there is a lot of learning coming out of it, but we have not yet seen a published report. And so I would not be able to comment on that pilot project more than that, but it is a pilot project and we are far from having any kind of inclusive education systematized in public school education system. I think Fadi is back.
I'm back. Thank you, Grace, for filling the gap. Thank you so much. I was just introducing the mental health. I was saying that today our understanding of mental health is not the absence of distress or illness. It's about to maximize my potential in order to lead a passionate life, a fulfilling life. And in order to do this, it's not about only my own resources, which is very essential, but it is about the support system that I have. That's why I'm going to address the state of our mental health today during and within the pandemic, and especially after Beirut blast, and how people in general and people with disability in specific, they are affected. What are the risks that they are facing? The second part is about questioning, aren't we all on the same boat due to the pandemic and everything that we are facing? And last, I will talk about what are the learned lessons and what of story of resiliency we can draw for our community and for our self in the coming future. So we know today that it's not about only the pandemic of COVID-19. This invisible enemy is challenging our mental health. So today it's about mental health pandemic as well. Maybe it's the first time in history we're talking that much about mental health and about well-being, because we are witnessing an increased level of anxiety, loneliness, depression, insomnia, self-harm, and even sometimes suicidal behavior. Without mentioning as well the reaction of fear, avoidance of people, fear of death, fear of getting isolated, stigmatization, fear of falling to provide even our essential items. And lately in Lebanon, we are living this challenges due to the lockdown and the confinement and all the, even the social media. We are witnessing every day the loss of people, of dear people, of beloved people, and life is becoming more and more challenging on many levels. Even a study showed that now 0.9% of participants of students experiencing severe anxiety, 2.7% moderate anxiety, 21.3% in mild anxiety due to all the situation. And if we want to mention Beirut blast, that no word can describe the trauma that we all faced in a way or another due to this disaster that we faced. We know how much that around 200 people, they lost their life. We have like 6,000 people who were injured, and some of them they have now either permanent or a long-lasting disability. But unfortunately, we don't have a specific data about those people and what kind of today of rehabilitation and support system we are providing to them. We know that many NGOs, they are active and we salute all their efforts, whether DPOs or NGOs, they are replacing the state because we know that we didn't have any disaster management plan, whether in the recovery, how to help those people to recover step by step. And today with the reconstruction of Beirut, we're hoping for a better Beirut. What are the plans? We know that there were some initiatives like the ESCWA initiative to make all the reconstruction inclusive, but still we are facing many challenges on that level. So in the lack of data, how can we assess the need? How can we know what kind of psychosocial support we need to cater for those people, for the generation, for the population in general and people with disability in a particular way. And many reports and articles, they were showing how much those people, they feel that they are left alone, facing this trauma without any hope for the future. So there's a lot to do, lot of things to do in order to activate the hope within those populations. If you want to talk in general about the mental health during the pandemic, we know that people with disability, they can face many stressors. The first stressor is about reporting a high level of social isolation than their non-disabled citizen, because already they are facing isolation because of all the barriers that they are facing. Now they are those kinds of barriers, they are more intense and they are facing more challenges on that level. And some of them, they are suffering from not having access to the socioeconomic resources and supportive social network. On the medical level, we know how much the absence of inclusive medical intervention could increase the anxiety and the fear of people with disability, especially when we have like medical discrimination that can be applied on people with disability. And we know all over the world, especially in the United States, how much some people they were not taken in consideration as on equal basis with other people when it comes to ensure the health services to those people. So policy around rationing of medical care can anticipate discriminatory attitudes toward people with disability during this time of crisis. Another risk is having to cope with the constraining protection measures. So we know that in case of people who rely on regular health care or rehabilitation appointments, need close contact from caregivers or health professionals to achieve their daily routine or have reduced ability to communicate with face mask, both speaking and hearing others. So those people, they are facing the fear of getting contaminated or contaminated the caregivers, and which is making the situation more complicated for those people. Another risk of isolated is for their protection. We know that not all, we should not conflate health status with disability. Many people with disability are healthy. However, some of them underlying or secondary aspect of their disability, like suppressed immune system or respiratory concern, can be exposed to vulnerability in this case. So when they are classified as high risk in the current pandemic, can cause additional stress and fears. How to face this issue, these challenges, especially with the lack of accessible information or health system that is able to contain all those challenges. Another risk that we can witness from the parents and caregivers of children with disability, high strain faced by parents and other family members caring for children with special needs such as autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, cerebral palsy, and chronic disability, and others. I mean, those parents need to cater for both the disrupted physical rehabilitation service, such as physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, behavioral therapy, and others, as well as to look after the well-being of their children. And with the absence of those services, especially in Lebanon, because of the pandemic, those children, they are used to a certain kind of routine and a framework in order to lead a stable and balanced life. So with all the disruption that they are faced, their parents and those children are facing more and more anxiety in order to adapt. We know that certain schools, specialized schools, they try to ensure online follow-up, but still it's still restricted to some, I would say, a very limited school in Lebanon, and we're not able to cater to all children, as Grace said before. So this disruption of normal routine and social uncertainty might create increased frustration and anxiety for children with AS and LD. Another risk of temporary barrier to become a regression, because we were opening the door for employment and education, and the question, would it be closed again? Are we at risk to deprioritize in a society that is even more unstable? So there is many questions. How are we facing those challenges? Are we seeing any kind of opportunities that we can reshape our society in terms of employment, policies, and accessibility? Because I will explain this later on. But first, I would love to ask you to write in the chat box three things you are not able to do due to the pandemic, so we can create more interaction between us. I'll give you just 30 seconds, and then I will tell you why I'm asking this question. Thank you, Dr. Musa, for providing this info. As I said, it's because of many DPOs we were able to cover many people. So I'm waiting for you on the chat box just to name three things you're not able to do due to the pandemic. Okay, so someone going out, see my friends, traveling, socializing, can't see friends and family, take my child to school. Excellent. So what are you sharing here? We can, excuse me, okay, next. So who's experiencing now barriers and limitation? Is it only people with disabilities? Or somehow we are all living this isolation? Maybe for the first time in history, we are living what we call the social model of disability, which we are facing social limitation, social interaction, and we're not able to live this life like before. So we are all versing in a state of sudden disability. And this is maybe the first time we are experiencing what people with disabilities are living in their everyday life, whether on the social level, education level, work level. When we're not able to have this access to our life, to our normal life, we are living a kind of disability in the social definition of term. But today, this problem that we are facing could open the door for a new opportunities, a new way of thinking, reshaping, designing our world. This is our hope today for the what we call the new normal. So it is like an invitation for us to live an experience of empathy. If you can find strength and energy in social life contact, you are all of a sudden living a kind of disability. Even Zoom fatigue, this is a new syndrome now because of all the connection interruptions that I even face right now here. And as if we are living what certain people with autism or dyslexia or dyspraxia, they are living in somehow in their struggle to communicate and to share their dreams or their needs or whatsoever. So could our struggle to feel connected encourage us to prioritize accessible information for all people with hearing and visual impairments? And most of all, if you are struggling with loneliness, feeling set apart, you can understand better those who are set apart because of their differences. So it's like an invitation to us to really actively hope for an inclusive Beirut. And I would present 6 at least recommendations that will help us to go in this sense. First of all, we need to collect and analyze data. We need to have specific data. How can we really design the needs of those people, their aspiration and their inclusion in what we call a better Beirut or better Lebanon in the next phase that we are going through. We need government policy makers and institutions to continue prioritizing inclusion efforts and consider it as an opportunity for societies and economy. And we experience somehow that we can work from home remotely. We can maybe introduce new ways of being and doing within our society and our workplace, our social life. What are the learning lessons? And how it could be aligned with the sustainable development goal as well to 230. And as you know, nothing about us without us, which involves that people with disability should be part of this whole process of the recovery and the reconstruction of Beirut. To reduce anxiety, secure accessibility of COVID-19 information in different formats. And we know that the National Program of Mental Health in Lebanon, they through Disability Hub, they were able to introduce disability criteria in their campaign. And they launched 2 campaigns, actually, one about COVID-19, the protection, and another one about mental health, where people with disability, they were part of this campaign. And they even ensured through Embrace a hotline to listen to the needs of people with disability. So those kind of small initiatives, whether from the national program or from DPOs, gave us some signs of hope that we are starting to design a better inclusive Beirut. Adapt confinement measure to the needs of specific groups to ensure their well-being. You know, people who need home assistance to keep receiving it, not to require from persons with psychosocial disability to live in total isolation. So we need to customize our service and not to treat everyone the same way, because it will never help to help them to ensure their well-being or their basic needs. There's no health without mental health, as I said before. Consider mental health as an integral part of our health, and to safeguard the mental health of our community, our healthcare workers, our adults, our women and children, and the most vulnerable of our society. WHO representative in Lebanon, Dr. Iman Shankiti. Sometimes it's okay not to be okay. Encourage youth to take care of their physical and mental health as well. And I would like to use the post-traumatic growth to open the space to reflect how can we benefit from this pandemic and this crisis to move forward. And I will refer to this Buddhist proverb saying that the lotus flower blooms most beautifully from the deepest and thickest mud. So the post-traumatic growth, usually it could came after a post-traumatic syndrome, PTSD. And what we mean by it, how can you experience a positive change that can happen in the wake of a traumatic event? It's a positive psychological change as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. It's not simply a return to baseline after a period of suffering. Instead, it's an experience of improvement. Post-traumatic growth event can act as a springboard to a life of higher functioning and deeper meaning. Miriam Akhtar, positive psychology expert. So the question that I would love to share with you, the reflection that post-traumatic growth challenge us on many levels, whether the sense of ourselves, the change in a relationship, and altered our philosophy on life. So for the new sense of life, I would love to ask the question, how can the consciousness that we might lose health make us appreciate life more? How can we have a higher sense of how we are all interconnected, and that giving an opportunity for all to flourish will positively impact our lives? On the relationship level, how can acceptance of vulnerability help us build closer relationship? How can we reshape our priorities, organization, economy, and environment? And finally, how can we value the value of how can the value of diversity and inclusion help us find more meaning and open up to a new opportunity in life? If we can approach all this trauma that we are living in Beirut, especially after Beirut blast, and go into post-traumatic growth, then we can really design a better Beirut and the desert life, a better life. And finally, what we will change? All things you will restart, new things you will start, all things you will cease, new thing will cease. I will give you all the time to reflect about it and try to answer this question based on your personal life and community life. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fadi, for a really thought-provoking talk, especially in terms of having us think about, the experience of the social model of disability. I think that's really interesting. And one thing that I think the pandemic has raised, I mean, in UK law, disability also includes mental health disability. I'm not sure where that stands in the Lebanese context, but you were focusing on mental health issues of people with disabilities, but also just raising the thought of if you have a long-term mental health challenge, is that a disability, thinking of it in terms of the social model of disability. So thank you very much. I see we have a couple of questions. One is for Grace, that is about the representation of people with disabilities. So thinking about it in terms of, in school books and so on, and just the concerns about, it says where students come from various cultural backgrounds, you'd highlight the idea that the disabled are the other, or would it help students at this stage to come to terms and accept the disabled as similar?
Yes.
If I can pass that to Grace.
Yes, so thank you for that question. I would like to say that there are beautiful books out there. There are beautiful children's books out there that do explain the value, about diversity and even difference, if I can say, to children. And I do agree that there is a general underrepresentation or even sometimes misrepresentation of children and or persons with disability in mainstream educational books. But I think the answer here would be yes for representation, but no for otherness. And I think the person who asked that question actually put that in there about not presenting people with disability as other people. And I would like to see them represented in educational books, just kind of like as a matter of fact, as a person being there. If they're showing a picture of children playing in the class, in the school playground, that there's just a child with a disability just playing with his peers. And I just have a nota bene here to say that this is an actual project that I'm personally working on with my husband and with a team of animators, because we did feel that in mainstream cartoons and just mainstream entertainment for children, there is not enough representation of characters with disability. And we did create a new animated series called Kids Go, which does promote these elements of diversity, acknowledging differences as a strength and as an asset. And it is called Kids Go. It is in French and English and Arabic, and it does present the main character, who is a lion, who is a wheelchair user, but he's super smart, super courageous. And that's kind of I just put it out there. And there's just one last issue which I would like to highlight, and this is something that just happened last week for me. I was looking into a school in Lebanon which has supposedly an inclusive education system, and the letter presented by the director of that special section in that school just literally promoted the program as saying children with disability, it will be good for them to interact with their peers, their normal peers, I would say, and they will be a good lesson of diversity and value of and tolerance to their other peers. And this is the kind of language that I think we should not perpetuate. I'm not sending my child to school for her to be a lesson on humanity and tolerance. I'm sending her to school to access proper education. And so this is the kind of otherness that unfortunately still exists.
Thank you, Grace. There's a question from Itab Sukaria. Don't we need to campaign for the activation of the law concerning the accessible public and private buildings in Lebanon? Do we have an accurate assessment of the level of accessibility of public and private buildings already existing in Lebanon? If I can direct this to Itab.
Hi. I would like to answer the question by saying we don't yet have a national accessibility standard in Lebanon. There is a decree which was issued in 2011 that has 6 criteria based on the physical accessibility. So it was mainly targeting wheelchair users, but there's nothing so much in depth about other types of disabilities. What we are working on as the Disability Hub at the moment is we worked on producing a guideline for creating heritage buildings and schools to be inclusive. And we're hoping to develop a few guidelines, more guidelines regarding, like workplace, how it should be inclusive, hospitals, because we know that hospitals, although they should be accessible for all, yet they are little consideration to accessibility. And also accessibility is mainly at the moment focusing on wheelchair users and tend to ignore other disabilities. As with the implementation of the law, yes, we should work on implementing the law more, and the law, in order to be implemented, there should be guidelines or mandated standards. And I think architects at the moment and designers, what I would say, they are not that much trained. They don't have the knowledge of creating inclusive spaces. And I don't blame them, because there is no curriculum at the moment enforcing designers to follow guidelines. Little information is provided for the generation, especially students who are studying design and architecture. They have little information, and most of the projects they have is not that much focusing on accessibility. So I think we should definitely work from different perspectives, working on the curriculum, improving the curriculum, working on enhancing, empowering, trying to empower and implement the law, and trying to have national guidelines and standards, and enforcing the implementation of these standards. And there are many recommendations which we will be sharing once we will be producing this report. Hopefully in March it will be shared, where we will have criteria, certain recommendations and plans, action plans for reconstructing or creating an inclusive recommendations for Beirut, but this can be applied across Lebanon as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Itab. I'm aware that we're a couple of minutes over. I just like to give anybody, final chance to ask any burning questions. Otherwise, do be in touch with CLS if you want to follow up on anything. So I'm just seeing if there's any final questions that we haven't answered. Okay, well, it's just left for me to thank you all so much for joining and giving your time, and a thanks to the fantastic panelists who've given their time to tell us about their critically important work. And it's a pleasure for me to have chaired this webinar. So thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Dr. Dina.
Okay.
So, Kiwan, I will just share the Lebanese mental health campaign about mental health. I will put it on the chat if you don't mind, so they can have an idea about it. And people with disability, they were part of it as well. So I will just put it on the chat for everyone to see before closing. Here you go. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that because there was a question from Dr. Musa Sharafuddin about the pilot project in the Mehi schools, but there are also some very interesting initiatives coming out, and I'm specifically mentioning transition to employment and job readiness, and there are two programs, the EUB Next Step program and the Université pour tous program at IUSG, who are now also being, I would say, pilot projects, and they're quite pioneers in how they're working on ensuring transition from education to employment for youth with intellectual disability. So there's a lot of things happening, and we can just only remain hopeful. And thank you, everyone, and thank you, Professor Kiwan, for moderating this discussion.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.